Nobody noticed the boy standing in the middle of the street. Cars honked. People hurried past. The traffic light changed color as always. And yet he remained there, gripping his cane tightly, trying to understand a world that hadn't waited for him. Perhaps someone saw it. Perhaps someone thought about stopping. But nobody stopped, until an old car braked in the middle of the intersection, ignoring horns, curses, and impatient stares. A woman stepped out of it, appearing neither hurried nor frightened nor confused. A woman too old to ask permission, and too experienced to ignore the danger. While the city protested, she walked over to the boy, positioned herself between him and the cars, and did something that no one else there had the courage to do. She stopped everything. At that moment, it wasn't just the traffic that stopped. It was indifference. And what that Mafia grandma did next didn't just save one child. He exposed an entire city. Margaret drove slowly that gray morning, not out of caution, but out of habit. At 79, she had already learned that those who live too fast tend to die too young. The traffic flowed impatiently around her old, impeccably preserved car, while she observed the city like someone reading a book, whose ending she already knows, but who insists on rereading it to understand the details that had previously gone unnoticed. It was at the noisiest intersection in the neighborhood that something broke the routine. A small boy, holding a white cane far too large for his own body, stood on the curb, trying to understand the chaos around him. Cars honked. People hurried past. No one stopped. The world continued demanding haste from those who couldn't see it. Margaret noticed it before everyone else because she recognized the kind of silence that precedes tragedy. She braked abruptly in the middle of the road, ignoring the immediate protests behind her. Drivers yelled, horns blared. Margaret turned off the engine with a calmness that only those who have faced worse can maintain. She opened the door and got out, ignoring the danger and the collective judgment. To her, that noise meant nothing. She had heard more dangerous screams in the past. The boy took an uncertain step forward, then retreated. His face was tense, but there was no crying. There was concentration. Margaret recognized that. Children who learn too early to fend for themselves don't cry easily. They calculate. She walked toward him with firm steps, positioning herself between the boy and the cars, as if marking her territory. "Can you stop for a moment?" she said loudly, not to the boy, but to the entire city. Something in her tone made the cars slow down. It wasn't official authority. It was something older. A type of command that isn't learned. It's built over decades of survival. Margaret slowly lowered herself until she was at the boy's level. "My name is Margaret," she said softly, "and I'm here." The boy turned his face toward her voice, confused but alert. I need to cross," he said. His voice was small, but determined. Margaret felt something stir within her. Not pity, responsibility. She held his hand firmly, without pulling, without forcing. "You will cross," she replied, but not alone. Around them, people began to pay attention. Some pulled out their cell phones, others murmured. Margaret didn't care. She had already learned that when something needs to be done, judgment comes later, if it comes at all. The traffic light turned green for the cars, but none moved forward. Something had changed in the air. Margaret raised her other hand, palm open, and the vehicles obeyed. Not because they were good, but because the unexpected is more frightening than the rule. She began to cross with the boy, step by step, feeling the slight tremor of his hand as he tried to orient himself by sound and touch. Midway across the street, a driver shouted something aggressive. Margaret stopped. She turned slowly. The man fell silent, unsure why. Her gaze held too many stories to be challenged by a hurried stranger. She said nothing. The silence was enough. Across the street, Margaret didn't let go of the boy's hand. "Do you live around here?" she asked. He nodded. "My mother works. I come home from school alone." Margaret felt the weight of the sentence settle in her chest. Alone. That word shouldn't exist for a child who is blind. But it did. Because the world decides who deserves care and who needs to learn to survive too early. A woman approached, nervous. "I saw everything," she said. "That was dangerous." Margaret looked at her calmly. "What's dangerous is pretending you didn't see," she replied. The woman didn't know what to say. Nobody knew, because the entire city had just been exposed. The boy shook Margaret's hand. "Thank you," he said. Margaret smiled slightly. "Do you have a name?" He replied. Margaret repeated the name aloud, as if recording something important. Names, for her, had always been a commitment. A black car pulled up across the street. Tinted windows, engine running. Margaret noticed it in the reflection. She didn't look away. She just positioned herself more comfortably, next to the boy. The car didn't move. Sometimes the past recognizes when it's not welcome. A police car appeared in the distance, not because of a formal call, but because something unusual had stopped traffic. The policeman approached, confused. "What's happening here?" he asked. Margaret replied simply, "A child crossing the street." The policeman looked around, not understanding the atmosphere. He nodded. There was nothing to dispute. People started commenting. "Did you see that? She stopped everything." "Who is that lady?" Margaret heard it all as distant noise. For her, only one thing mattered. The boy was safe at that moment, and that was enough to justify any consequence. When the boy's mother arrived running, breathless, Margaret was already standing beside the boy, keeping him calm. The woman cried as she hugged him. "I only turned for a minute," she repeated. Margaret didn't judge. She simply placed her hand on the woman's shoulder. "Minutes count too," she said without accusation, with truth. Before leaving, Margaret crouched down again before the boy. "The world doesn't always stop," she said. "But today it did." The boy smiled. A small smile, but a complete one. Margaret felt something old reorganize itself within her. Something that had to do with choice. When she returned to her car, she found several cell phones pointed at her. Margaret got in, started the engine, and drove off without looking back. She knew it wouldn't end there. Cities don't like it when someone interrupts their indifference. As she drove, Margaret was certain of one thing. This had not been an isolated gesture. It had been a warning. To the world, to the past, to those who still thought that old women were only good for observing. She hadn't just stopped the car. The entire city had come to a standstill. And when a Mafia grandma decides to stop something, that's because what comes next will not be ignored. Margaret didn't get out of the car just to help a child. She got out because she recognized a pattern too old to ignore. Stepping onto the asphalt, she felt the same kind of chill she had felt decades before, when quick decisions separated lives that would continue from those that would be interrupted. The city may not know, but Margaret did. Intersections are places of choice, and that choice had been pushed onto a boy who shouldn't have to bear it alone. The honking of horns didn't hurry her along. On the contrary, Margaret had always known that chaos tries to win through haste. She walked with deliberate steps, feeling every gaze turn against her, assessing her as an inconvenient obstacle. Old woman, stopped car, problem. She had been called a problem before, and had outlived everyone who tried to solve her. When she positioned herself in front of the boy, Margaret realized how much he depended on sound to understand the world. The noise of the engines, the echo of footsteps, the wind cutting through the buildings. Everything reached him without hierarchy. Someone was needed to organize that noise. Margaret did this with her own body, becoming a spatial reference, a physical barrier, a fixed point. She didn't touch the boy immediately. First she spoke. Her voice was low, firm, steady. Margaret knew that touch, when it comes without warning, can frighten more than help. She introduced herself as one who signs a contract. She said her name because names create responsibility. When the boy responded, the connection was made. The whole town could ignore it. But between them there was now a silent agreement. Holding his hand, Margaret felt something that carried her back in time. That small, tense hand, trying to trust without seeing, reminded her of other hands she had held in moments of absolute risk. People who didn't ask for help because they learned too early that the world exacts a high price for it. Margaret didn't feel pity. She felt recognition. Traffic began to reorganize around them, not out of collective empathy, but out of discomfort. Drivers didn't know how to react when someone broke the logic of, "Go ahead." Margaret always knew this. Indifference depends on fluidity. When something stops, it forces everyone to choose a side, even if it's the side of shameful inaction. Midway through the crossing, Margaret heard the insult coming from behind. An impatient man, protected by the steering wheel and anonymity. She stopped not to confront him verbally, but to remind him that there were still limits that didn't belong to traffic, but to conscience. The silence that followed was heavy. The man didn't move forward, not because he had learned anything, but because he realized he was facing someone who wouldn't back down. The boy asked if everything was all right. Margaret answered honestly, "It is now." That answer contained more truth than any empty promise. Margaret never promised the world. She promised a safe moment, and that often was enough to change trajectories. When they reached the other side of the street, Margaret realized she couldn't simply walk away. Something about that boy, the way he held his cane, the way he listened, told her that this wasn't the first time he'd faced the world alone. And Margaret had always been suspicious of systems that call early independence abandonment. People began to approach, uttering ill-fitting phrases. What courage! What madness! What danger! Margaret listened to it all as one listens to rain hitting a window pane. None of those phrases changed the essential fact. No one had stopped before, and that was what truly mattered. When the black car appeared, Margaret felt the past breathing too close. It didn't turn its face away. It didn't stiffen. It only adjusted its posture. The past always recognizes when it finds someone it shouldn't provoke. The car stayed. It observed and decided not to move on. Small victories count too. The mother's arrival was chaotic, like almost all late arrivals. Guilt, fear, rushed explanations. Margaret didn't add weight to what was already too heavy. She simply said what was essential. Women don't need to be crushed to learn. They need to be supported enough to keep going. Before leaving, Margaret noticed the cell phones. She knew exactly what that meant. She knew the gesture would be distorted, reduced, turned into a shallow headline. She didn't care. She never had. Those who lived what she lived don't act to be understood. They act to interrupt what shouldn't continue. As she drove away, Margaret felt something had been triggered. Not an immediate conflict, but a chain reaction. Someone would ask who she was. Someone would connect old dots. Someone would try to measure boundaries. She accepted this calmly. This was nothing new. It was a return. Margaret hadn't stopped just to help a blind boy. She had stopped because she recognized a structural flaw, because he saw a child being pushed to the invisible edge, because he understood that when the world fails, someone needs to step in. And at that intersection, the entire city learned something uncomfortable. Sometimes, all it takes is a Mafia grandma to expose everything that was wrong, and nobody had the courage to correct it. Margaret didn't go straight home after the intersection. She changed her route twice, not out of paranoia, but methodically. Decades living on the fringes of the predictable had taught her that public events attract dangerous curiosities. She drove with the serenity of someone who had been hunted before and knew exactly when she wasn't. The black car didn't follow her. Still, Margaret sensed that something had been triggered. Gestures like that are never isolated. The boy stayed with her longer than expected. The mother, still in shock, needed to breathe before regaining control. Margaret noticed this and didn't rush anything. She took them both to a simple coffee shop on the corner, a place where ordinary people come and go without registering their names. She ordered hot chocolate for the boy before he even asked. Small details build trust faster than speeches. The boy spoke little, but listened to everything. Margaret noticed how he organized the space with the touch of his cane, how he memorized sounds to create invisible maps. That required constant intelligence, an effort that no one recognized. Margaret felt something close to anger. Not explosive, but lucid. Anger at systems that praise overcoming challenges when, in fact, they failed first. The mother explained the routine with interrupted sentences. Working 2 shifts, public school without adequate support, a neighborhood that feigned inclusion while pushing responsibilities onto those already at their limit. Margaret listened without judgment. She had heard too many similar stories. The problem was never individual. It was always structural. When the mother finally composed herself, she thanked her more times than Margaret thought necessary. Margaret interrupted with firm gentleness. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank me when it's no longer necessary." The woman didn't fully understand, but she felt the weight of the phrase. Some truths take time to settle in. As she left the cafeteria, Margaret noticed the stairs. People were whispering. Someone asked to take a picture. Another wanted to know her name. Margaret politely refused everything. Excessive visibility distorts intentions. She didn't want to become a symbol. She wanted to become a consequence. On her way back to the car, a man approached her. Cheap suit, practiced smile, excessive curiosity. "You are very brave," he said. Margaret stopped and stared at him with surgical attention. "Not brave," she replied. "Responsibility." The man laughed nervously, unsure if it was a compliment or a warning. Margaret kept walking. She didn't need to clarify. At home, Margaret didn't turn on the television. I didn't need to see the edited action itself in dramatic angles. She made tea, sat at the table, and let the silence settle in. Her body was tired, but her mind worked with precision. She knew that when someone exposes a public flaw, others begin to surface. The phone rang in the early evening. An old contact, a low voice. "You showed up today," Margaret confirmed without emotion. "I did." The voice on the other end hesitated. "That caught my attention." Margaret smiled slightly. "It was the idea." There was a heavy silence before the reply. "You go too far," Margaret replied with absolute calm. "I stopped halfway. They're the ones who went too far." That same night, the video began circulating. It wasn't accurate. It never is. Wrong cuts. Superficial comments. Some called it heroism. Others, irresponsibility. Margaret didn't read it. She had already learned that public opinion is noise without memory. What matters is who acts afterward. And someone acted. A representative from the city hall contacted her the following morning. A rehearsed speech. Words like accessibility, protocol, evaluation. Margaret listened without interrupting. When the man finished, she asked a single question. "How many blind children cross that street every day?" The man stammered. Margaret thanked him for the call and hung up. The answer had already been given. Margaret returned to the intersection the next day, alone. She stood there observing the flow of people, the timing of the traffic light, the hurried pace of the pedestrians. She saw another child waiting, not blind, but invisible in another way. That confirmed what she suspected. The problem wasn't an exception. It was a poorly designed rule. A car slowed down when it recognized her. The same black car, now further away. Margaret held her gaze at the reflection in the window. The car drove on. The past had tested limits, but hadn't yet moved forward. A good sign. It meant someone was calculating risks. Upon returning home, Margaret made a decision that would change the course of the next few weeks. Providing occasional help wouldn't be enough. Exposing it wouldn't be enough. She would do what she always did when something was structurally wrong. Organize the consequences. She called 3 people. None of them asked why. They just listened. When she hung up, Margaret felt the familiar weight of when something truly begins. Not adrenaline. Accumulated responsibility. Late in the afternoon, the boy's mother called again. She wanted to know if she had done something wrong, if she had exposed herself too much, if this would cause problems. Margaret answered with gentle firmness. "You didn't do anything wrong. The mistake is when nothing happens." The woman cried silently. Margaret waited. Some pauses heal more than answers. Margaret realized that the boy's name was no longer just a name. It was a silent commitment. And commitments like that never come alone. They pull threads. They reveal systems. They demand a stance. That night, Margaret slept little. Not out of fear. Out of anticipation. She knew someone would try to twist the narrative. She knew subtle pressures would come. She knew the world doesn't like it when someone publicly interrupts its indifference. And yet, she was ready. Because when a Mafia grandma decides to go beyond the initial gesture, the shock lies not in what she does on the street. It's in what changes after everyone thinks it's over. Margaret knew that the second day after a public event is always more dangerous than the first. On the first day, people react impulsively. On the second, they begin to construct narratives. She woke up early, not because she had slept little, but because her old body already knew the rhythm of conflict. She made coffee as usual, opened the window and let the cold air in. The world outside seemed too normal for what was about to happen. The phone didn't ring in the early hours, a clear sign of behind-the-scenes activity. When no one calls, it's because they're talking amongst themselves. Margaret spent the morning reviewing simple reports she'd requested the previous day. They weren't official documents, but snippets of reality. Traffic schedules, near-miss records, ignored reports. The intersection was no exception. It was a recurring problem area. She returned to the location once more, this time without getting out of the car. She observed how drivers sped ahead seconds before the traffic light turned red, how pedestrians waited longer than reasonable, how people with disabilities were forced to negotiate their own safety. At every crossing, Margaret felt a lucid anger growing, not the kind that explodes, the kind that is calculated. Late in the morning, the press showed up, not at the intersection, but at her door. Margaret didn't answer. Journalists don't want solutions. They want scenes. She knew that speaking at that moment would mean losing control of the narrative. Instead, she did something more effective. She called someone who didn't appear on camera, but who influenced decisions. The meeting took place in an old town hall building, far from the brightly lit offices. Margaret entered unannounced. She didn't need to be. She'd walked through worse corridors in the past. The man who greeted her tried to appear formal, but couldn't hide his discomfort. "This got out of hand," he said. Margaret sat down without replying. "You created a problem." Margaret finally spoke. "The problem already existed. I just stood in front of it." He tried to argue using protocols, deadlines, budget limitations. Margaret listened with surgical patience. When she finished, she placed something simple on the table, a sequence of times and records showing how many times tragedy had almost occurred at that spot. "How many deaths justify an adjustment?" she asked. The man didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because he knew too much. Meanwhile, the video continued to spread, now with analysis, debates, and polarization. People argued about whether Margaret had acted rightly or wrongly, as if morality were more important than the real risk that existed every day. Margaret didn't watch any of that. She had already learned that when the debate begins, action usually stops, and she had no intention of stopping. In the middle of the afternoon, the first direct attack came, a formal notification accusing Margaret of obstructing traffic and endangering public safety. Clean language for intimidation. She read it calmly, folded the paper, and placed it next to her coffee. She didn't call lawyers. She called her memory. She knew exactly who was behind that attempt to frame her. The black car reappeared, this time parked too close to her house. Margaret watched from behind the curtain, with no apparent tension. The man inside the car didn't get out. He just waited. Margaret smiled slightly. Waiting is always a sign of weakness, when you believe the other person will back down first. She left the house and walked slowly to the car. She tapped lightly on the window. The man looked down, surprised. "You're in the wrong place," Margaret said. Her voice didn't carry an explicit threat, but it carried a story. The man tried to say something about orders, about observation. Margaret tilted her head. "Observe something else," she replied. "That kind of pressure works on those who are still afraid." The car drove away in less than a minute. That night, Margaret received an unexpected call. The boy's mother. The voice was different, firmer. "They put a traffic officer there today," she said. "And they talked about changing the traffic light." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. Not out of relief, out of confirmation. The system only reacts when exposed to cost. But not everyone was satisfied. A group of local merchants began to complain. They said the slow traffic was hurting sales. Margaret heard the indirect accounts and felt the old pattern repeating itself. Profit always tries to take precedence over lives when no one forces a choice. She decided to confront it directly. He went to a community meeting that same week. He entered without announcing his name. He sat in the back. He listened to shallow arguments, empty complaints, disconnected numbers of people. When he finally spoke, a heavy silence fell. "How many of you cross the street with your eyes closed?" he asked. No one answered. "Then don't speak as if you know." The tension increased when someone recognized Margaret. Murmurs, cell phones. She didn't move. She continued speaking with absolute calm about collective responsibility, about real cost, about who pays when something goes wrong. It wasn't an inspiring speech. It was uncomfortable, and that's exactly why it worked. On her way out, a man confronted her with restrained aggression. "You like attention," he said. Margaret looked at him with utter coldness. "No," she replied. "I like well-executed interruptions." The man backed away. The phrase stuck. The intersection began to change in the following days. First small adjustments, then visible alterations. The flow slowed down. People began to cross with less fear. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, and beginnings require constant vigilance. The boy returned to the intersection with his mother a few days later. Margaret was there, watching from a distance. She didn't approach. She didn't need to. She saw him cross more safely. She saw his mother breathe a sigh of relief. That was enough. The initial gesture had become a structure. But the conflict wasn't over yet. Margaret knew. When something changes, someone loses power. And whoever loses power tries to regain it. She felt this when she received one last informal warning. "You messed with big shots." Margaret replied with final serenity. "Big shots don't leave children at risk." That night, Margaret reflected on the past with rare clarity. She thought about how many times she had acted in the dark, away from cameras, away from applause. This time was different. This time, the gesture had been public, and that demanded another kind of firmness. Not the firmness of imposed fear, but the firmness of sustained consistency. She knew the city wouldn't change entirely because of her. But she also knew that no one would forget that intersection. And remembered intersections are watched intersections. That's how real protected zones were created. Margaret felt the weight of age as she lay down. But along with the weariness came something rare. Alignment. The past, the present, and the decision had met at the same point. Few people experience this. And while the city slept, reorganizing its flaws, Margaret was certain of one thing. She hadn't just stopped the traffic. He had forced the world to look where it had always averted its eyes, and that, sooner or later, it always demands an answer. The weather started behaving differently after the intersection changed. It wasn't something that made the news, nor did it become a political campaign. It was more subtle, the kind of change that only those who cross the street every day notice. The traffic light took a little longer to change. Cars braked sooner. Drivers honked less. The city didn't get better. But it became less hostile at that specific point. And for Margaret, that was already a concrete victory. She continued to pass through the intersection frequently, but never at the same time. She observed from inside the car, sometimes from outside, like a sentinel who doesn't need to be seen to fulfill her duty. She noticed how people crossed with less haste, how mothers held their children's hands more firmly, how elderly people felt less pushed by the cruel logic of, "Hurry up." That wasn't heroism. It was belated human engineering. Margaret's name began circulating in places she had never set foot in closed meetings, in administrative corridors, in whispered conversations that began with, "That lady." Some said she was dangerous, others that she was crazy. The more observant said it was best not to provoke her. Margaret wasn't bothered by any of these versions. Reputations have always been tools. What mattered was the effect. The City Hall announced an ongoing study to review crossings in sensitive areas, bureaucratic language, a vague promise. Margaret read the note carefully and smiled slightly. She didn't believe in announcements. She believed in continuity. She knew that systems only truly change when someone is watching after the spotlight fades. And she intended to watch. The boy crossed the street alone again, but now with an officer nearby and slower traffic around him. Margaret watched from a distance, sitting in the car, her hands firmly on the steering wheel. He felt a slight tightness in his chest, not from fear but from memory. He remembered how many children hadn't had someone who would stop the world for them. That would never stop hurting, but now it hurt purposefully. The boy's mother began to greet Margaret whenever she saw her, not with idolatry, but with silent recognition, an exchange of glances that said, "I know." Margaret accepted this without elaborating. Excessive gratitude creates dependence. She wanted to create autonomy for that woman, for that child, for the city, if possible. The veiled attacks diminished over time. Not because people agreed with Margaret, but because they realized that persisting would be costly. Some battles aren't worth fighting when the other side doesn't tire. Margaret never tired when the cause was just. She simply recalculated. The black car never reappeared. Not because of definitive defeat, but because of a tacit understanding. The past had acknowledged that that front was closed. Margaret knew that this didn't mean absolute peace, but it meant limits, and limits are essential for long-term survival. As the months passed, other stories began to emerge. A wheelchair user who finally managed to cross the street without assistance. A woman who stopped running out of fear. A child who no longer needed to be pulled by the arm. Small victories scattered about without clear authorship. Margaret never claimed any of them. Did you know that the best kind of change is the one that no one tries to steal? Her body began to demand longer breaks. Margaret started driving less, walking less, observing more. She didn't feel this as a loss. She felt it as a transition. For her, aging was never about going backward. It was about shifting her point of influence. She began writing handwritten notes. Nothing organized, nothing linear. Just loose thoughts about what she had seen, experienced, interrupted. It wasn't a diary, it was a record. Margaret always believed that forgetting is the greatest ally of injustice. Writing was a way to resist erasure. One afternoon he received an unexpected call. A younger woman, a civil servant, was asking for guidance. "I saw what you did," he said. Margaret listened in silence. "And I wanted to know how to proceed." Margaret replied with rare frankness. "Don't wait for permission. Wait for conviction." The call ended there. Margaret felt that something was being passed on. The intersection became an informal landmark. People would say, "Near that place where everything changed." Margaret heard this from a stranger and almost smiled, not out of ego, but because it confirmed that the gesture had entered the collective memory. And collective memory creates social vigilance. Social vigilance creates protection. There was a day when Margaret didn't go to the intersection, not because she forgot, but by choice. She stayed home, watching the city from afar. And for the first time, she didn't feel guilty. The world continued to function without her constant presence. That was a sign of success. Change isn't created to become indispensable. It's created so that it can emerge. The boy grew a few centimeters. The cane was adjusted. His voice became more confident. Margaret observed this transformation without intervening. That child was no longer just someone she had helped. He was someone who walked more confidently through the world. That was enough. Public discussions cooled. The video lost its impact. The internet moved on to the next shock. Margaret knew this was inevitable, but she also knew that established structures don't disappear with immediate forgetfulness. They remain until someone tries to break them again. And now, there were more watchful eyes. Margaret came to be seen as a silent reference. She wasn't invited to give lectures or receive tributes. She was remembered when someone needed to choose between convenience and humanity. This kind of influence doesn't appear on plaques. It appears in choices. One night, Margaret dreamed of old intersections, places where she hadn't stopped, children she hadn't had time to reach. She woke up with a tight chest, but not devastated. She understood that one doesn't live to save everything. One lives to interrupt enough. She began to sleep more. Her body demanded it. Her mind accepted it. There was no pending urgency, nothing unfinished. The story had followed its natural course after the initial shock. That was rare and precious. On a clear morning, Margaret passed through the intersection one last time before deciding to permanently change her route. She looked around, took a deep breath, and continued on. She didn't need to check anymore. The city had learned. Because in the end, Margaret didn't just shock the city by stopping her car. She shocked the city because she reminded everyone of something forgotten. The world only remains unjust when no one intervenes. And when a Mafia grandma does that, it's not an impulse. It's experience. It's a memory. That's the limit. She left no monuments. He left a safe passage. And that, for someone who lived as she lived, it's the highest type of legacy possible. What came next wasn't noise. It was habit. People started crossing the street looking at each other. Not just at the traffic light. Drivers learned to brake before the limit, not out of fear of a fine, but because of a recent memory. The memory that someone, one day, stopped everything for a child who couldn't see. Memories like that don't need names. They need repetition. Margaret realized that the intersection had become an invisible meeting point, not of people, but of decisions. Those who passed through seemed to slow down their bodies and minds. It was as if the place carried a silent plea for attention. The city, which had always demanded haste, was beginning to accept small pauses, and small pauses save lives. The boy's mother changed jobs months later, not because of a miraculous promotion, but because of an opportunity that came her way. Someone recommended her. Someone trusted her. That's how the world works when one gear stops crushing the other. Margaret learned about this by chance. In a short conversation, she didn't comment. She knew that the best help is the kind that allows a person to move on without needing to come back to say, "Thank you." The boy grew more confident in the sound of his own voice. He began to walk with longer strides, to speak with greater clarity. Margaret saw him one last time, from afar, laughing at something she couldn't see, but could feel. It struck her with a quiet force. True joy rarely makes a sound. It settles down. Other intersections began to change, not by decree, but by comparison. Why does it work there and not here? The question began to circulate. Margaret didn't answer. The right questions find answers even without supervision, and when they do, they stay. The city attempted discreet tributes. An invitation here, another there. Margaret refused them all, not out of modesty, but strategically. Turning gestures into ceremonies usually neutralizes them. She preferred the act to remain simple, almost anonymous, impossible to co-opt. Over time, Margaret began to go out less. Her body demanded more frequent rest, and she listened. There was no new urgency, no glaring failure requiring immediate interruption. This didn't mean the world was right. It only meant that, in that area, someone had done enough. She organized old papers, burned what no longer needed to exist, and kept what still had a purpose. For Margaret, the past was always a tool, never a prison. By freeing up space, you felt the present breathe easier. Conversations with younger people became more common. They weren't seeking heroic advice. They were seeking confirmation. "Is it worth stopping?" Margaret would answer with stark honesty. "It's worth it, when the cost of continuing is greater." There was no formula. There was a criterion. On some nights, the dream would return to the initial intersection. This time, however, without noise, just the feeling of having arrived in time. I would wake up tired but whole. There was no longer that urgency to correct the entire past, only the serenity of having interrupted enough. The neighborhood began to recognize itself as a viable place for those who walk slowly. Elderly people started to circulate more. Children played near the curb without the constant panic of adults. It wasn't utopia. It was adjustment. Adjustments change destinies without promising miracles. Margaret accepted for the first time that her presence was no longer needed every day. This wasn't abandonment. It was success. When something continues without you, it's because it was well done. She made one last handwritten note on a simple piece of paper. Stopping is also acting. She folded the paper and put it away where no one would find it by chance. Some truths need to remain private so they don't fade away. On a clear late afternoon, Margaret crossed the intersection, as if bidding farewell to an old acquaintance. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. She continued on, certain that the world there had learned something basic and powerful. Seeing is not the same as perceiving. And as he continued, he felt something rare. Not pride, not triumph, but a functional peace. The peace of someone who understands that they did what they could, when they could, in the right way. Because the legacy of a Mafia grandma isn't in the fear she inspires, but in the care that she normalizes. It's not in the noise it makes, but in the safe silence it leaves behind. Margaret didn't shock the city enough to be remembered. It caused a shock, forcing the city to change its habits. And when the habit changes, the future is less risky. That was the end. Not with applause, but with free passage. After everything seemingly stabilized, Margaret realized something few people notice when an event ends. The world never returns exactly to what it was before. It just learns to better disguise its flaws. The intersection was safer, yes, but the city continued to demand haste, continued to reward those who pass by too quickly and ignore those who need time. This realization didn't bother her. It only kept her alert. She began to observe people who had no direct connection to what had happened. An elderly man struggling to cross the street, a woman pushing a heavy cart, a teenager too distracted to notice the danger. Margaret saw in them echoes of the same problem. The difference was that now someone had named the risk, and when the risk is named, it ceases to be invisible. Margaret thought a lot about growing old in a world that pretends to respect the elderly, but doesn't organize itself for them. Experience is often celebrated in speeches, but ignored in practice. She knew this because she had lived long enough to realize when she was only listened to out of politeness. Even so, at that intersection, her age was precisely what gave weight to the gesture. No one easily questions someone who carries decades in their gaze. At night, when the silence grew thicker, Margaret remembered other streets, other times, other children. Not all had been saved. Not all had found someone willing to stop. These memories didn't come as guilt, but as an emotional inventory. She carried no regrets. She carried memories, and memory, when used well, becomes a criterion. The boy began to occupy her daily thoughts, even without direct contact. Margaret wondered how he would interpret that scene in the future. Would he remember the noise, the firm touch, the improbable pause? Children retain more than adults imagine. Sometimes a single interruption becomes a lifelong reference point. The boy's mother, without realizing it, also began to change. Margaret learned from others that she started asking more questions, seeking support, and not accepting vague answers. Not because she had become combative, but because she had understood something simple. When someone stops for you once, you learn that you deserve for the world to stop other times as well. Margaret observed this with a respectful distance. She never called to demand gratitude, never showed up to follow up on results. Her logic was always clear. Those who help expecting something in return end up creating dependency, and dependency has never been liberation. The days went by, and the video quickly faded from the internet's memory. This didn't surprise her. She knew that the real impact doesn't happen on the feed, but in daily life. People don't change because they saw something once. They change because they were forced to adapt afterward. She began to notice small changes in drivers' behavior. Not all of them, never all of them, but enough to create a new minimum standard. Braking before the crosswalk, looking both ways, respecting other people's time. It wasn't full empathy, it was habit, and habit sustains more than emotion. Margaret reflected a lot on this. The world doesn't need to be good to function better. It just needs to be less indifferent. And indifference is combated with interruption, not with speeches. As the weeks passed, her body craved more rest. She accepted. She reduced her outings, organized the house to require less effort, and sat more often by the window. Her gaze remained attentive, but the pace was different. There was no urgency. What needed to be done had already been done. She began to think about her own legacy without romanticizing it. She didn't want to be remembered as a heroine, nor as a folkloric figure. She preferred the idea of having been a turning point, something that doesn't appear in books but silently alters trajectories. On a rainy afternoon, Margaret daydreamed about an empty intersection, without cars, without hurry. Not as a utopia, but as a metaphor, a place where no one needed to fight for space to exist. She woke up with the feeling that this dream wasn't about streets, but about time. She realized that growing old also means learning to leave the stage at the right time. Staying too long transforms care into control. Margaret never confused protection with possession. That's why she decided that this would be her last direct involvement, not out of tiredness, but out of consistency. The boy grew a little more. The cane changed, the posture too. Margaret saw him from afar one last time and understood that she didn't need to get closer. Some stories don't require explicit closure. They close on their own, when they fulfill their purpose. The city continued to make mistakes in many other areas. It always would. Margaret knew this, but she also knew that now there was a precedent, an uncomfortable reminder that someone can stop everything if they deem it necessary. And that possibility changes behaviors, even when it's not used. She began to write less and observe more. Age brought selective clarity. Not everything deserves energy. Not every problem requires direct confrontation, but some demand a firm presence, and she would still know how to recognize those. When Margaret reflected on her own life, she didn't engage in dramatic emotional analysis. She simply lined up the facts. She survived. She made choices. She interrupted. She protected when necessary. That was enough. There was no emptiness. There was closure. On a particularly quiet night, Margaret reflected on how the world often underestimates older women. They think they are slow, frail, predictable. Little do they know that it is precisely these women who have seen enough to act without hesitation. That night confirmed something she had always known. Age does not weaken, it refines. The intersection was still there, functioning. People crossed. Cars stopped. Life went on. And that was the greatest possible sign of success. Nothing extraordinary, just safe. Margaret closed her eyes peacefully. Nothing was pending. No story was unfinished. The gesture had been made. The effect spread. Time respected. Because in the end she didn't change the whole city. Enough has changed. And sometimes that's all a life well lived needs to do. As the months passed, Margaret began to notice something curious. Even when she wasn't present, people still acted as if someone were watching. Not out of fear, but out of memory. Memory that this place had already been disrupted once. And disrupted places carry a kind of invisible surveillance. The city learns quickly when it understands that the mistake has already been exposed. She began to notice this at other intersections as well. Small, spontaneous adjustments. A driver yielding the right of way without legal obligation. A pedestrian waiting a little longer to ensure safety. It wasn't sudden kindness. It was awakened awareness. Margaret knew that awareness doesn't spring from long speeches, but from experiences that break the automatic. Margaret reflected a great deal on how the gesture had been interpreted by different people. Some saw courage. Others saw madness. Few understood the essence. But that was never a problem for her. Those who act expecting understanding usually give up too soon. She acted because she recognized the urgency, not because she expected agreement. One morning, Margaret walked across the intersection and realized that no one recognized her. No curious glances, no cameras, no comments. That made her smile almost imperceptibly. The anonymity, at that point, was a sign that the gesture had already been absorbed into everyday life. When something ceases to be an exception, it becomes the norm. She began to walk more slowly, relying on her own pace. There was no rush to get anywhere. Time, for her, had ceased to be an adversary. It had become an ally. Each step carried the serenity of someone who no longer needs to prove strength, only to exert it when necessary. Sometimes Margaret thought about how many older women carry similar stories and have never been heard. Women who interrupted tragedies at home, at work, on the street, without an audience, without recognition. The difference was that, this time, the interruption had been public, and the public was not used to seeing older women occupying space with such firmness. She noticed that some people had begun to look at older women differently. Not all, of course, but some. And small changes accumulate strength. Margaret always believed that. The world doesn't turn all at once. It tilts, little by little. In occasional conversations, Margaret would hear phrases like, "If it were that lady," or "just like what happened at that intersection." Her name wasn't always mentioned, and that was a good thing. The gesture had become a reference, not a biography. References survive better than names. The boy was no longer just the blind boy. He was now seen as a child, period. For Margaret, this was one of the greatest victories. When someone ceases to be defined by vulnerability, something essential changes in collective perception. There were days when Margaret wondered if she would have done the same if she were younger. The answer always came with uncomfortable clarity. Perhaps not. Youth often trusts too much that the world will sort itself out. Age teaches that often someone needs to step in. She began to organize her belongings more carefully, not out of a premonition of the end, but out of a clear sense of continuity. Putting things in order is a silent way of showing respect for those who remain. Margaret always thought this way. On a golden late afternoon, Margaret sat again by the window and watched the distant flow of the city. There was no tension in her body, only presence. She understood that she no longer needed to be on guard. The initial gesture had created enough memory to sustain her for some time. Margaret knew that other failures would arise. They always do. But he also knew that now there was a precedent, and precedents change behaviors more than promises. She closed her eyes for a few moments and took a deep breath. There was no regret. There was no inflated pride. There was something rarer, coherence, the feeling that, on that specific day, in the middle of that street, she had been exactly who she needed to be. And while the world continued its imperfect course, Margaret remained with a quiet certainty. There's no need to save everything. There's no need to change everyone. You don't have to win all the time. Sometimes all it takes is stopping at the right moment, so that the rest of the journey becomes possible. And this certainty, this solid calm, it was the true end that Margaret carried with her. Time hadn't changed the city spectacularly, but it had changed it enough that anyone crossing that street could feel the difference. It wasn't something that appeared in advertisements or reports, but it was there, in the way the cars slowed down before the crosswalk, in the way pedestrians no longer had to fight for space with fear in their eyes. Margaret observed this from a distance, with the clear conscience of someone who knows when an action has fulfilled its purpose. She never believed that a single gesture could transform everything. What he always believed, however, was that certain gestures create precedents, and precedents alter behavior, even when no one publicly admits to being influenced. The intersection had become one of those points where the mistake no longer went unnoticed, and that, for Margaret, was worth more than any acknowledgement. The boy grew up without fully understanding the weight of what had happened that day. For him, it was just a different kind of crossing, an unexpected pause in the usual chaos. But Margaret knew that, somewhere in her memory, that interruption would be recorded as silent proof that the world can sometimes stop for someone like him. And that certainty changes how a child faces the future. The mother, in turn, began to walk with less guilt and more firmness. Not because life had become easy, but because she had learned that she didn't need to accept everything in silence. Margaret never stepped in to support this process. It wasn't her style. She believed that the best help is that which allows the other person to move forward without depending on your constant presence. As the months passed, Margaret's name faded from memory, as happens with almost anything that doesn't hold up in the spotlight. And that was exactly what she wanted. The effect of her gesture remained even when public curiosity waned, proving that real change doesn't need an audience to continue to exist. Margaret felt her body crave less movement and more observation. She accepted this without resistance. For her, aging had never meant retreating, but rather choosing better where to direct her energy. She no longer needed to be in the thick of things every day. It was enough to know that, if necessary, she would still recognize the exact moment. She began to observe the city with a more distant, almost contemplative gaze. She knew that the world would continue to fail in many other ways, that other children would still be ignored, that other journeys would still demand too much courage from those who shouldn't need it. But she also knew that now there was a concrete example of a possible interruption. The intersection had become just another place on the map for most people. For Margaret, it remained a landmark, not of pride but of consistency, a reminder that she had acted according to everything she believed in. At the moment, she believed it was necessary. Few people have that chance. She never considered herself a heroine, nor did she like it when people tried to label her as such. Heroism is often used to soften collective responsibilities. Margaret preferred to think that she had done the obvious thing that no one else wanted to do at that moment. And the obvious, when ignored for too long, ends up seeming extraordinary. The days passed more quietly. Margaret organized the house, reduced excesses, and kept only what still made sense. There was a new serenity in these simple gestures, as if everything in its place confirmed that nothing important had been left undone. The past was in order, and the present sufficient. On some nights, she still thought about how many times she had gone through similar situations throughout her life, in much darker contexts, where stopping wasn't a safe option. That journey, compared to all of that, seemed small, but that's precisely why it had such an impact. Sometimes the right gesture at the right time speaks louder than years of confrontation. Margaret realized that the city had begun to police itself in that area, not out of deep empathy, but out of learned habit. And habits, unlike emotions, are difficult to break. This was always the kind of change she considered effective. The boy crossed the street now with more confidence, unaware that someone, silently, was still watching from afar. Margaret felt no need to approach. Some stories don't ask for reunions. They only ask for continuity without interference. She accepted that this had been her last great public gesture, not out of weakness, but out of understanding. There comes a point when insistence becomes excessive, and Margaret always knew the difference between firmness and stubbornness. Knowing when to stop is also wisdom. When reflecting on her own journey, she didn't make dramatic assessments. She saw a sequence of difficult choices made with the clarity possible for each period. That journey fit as a symbolic closure, not as a culmination, a peaceful final point. Margaret began to sleep better. Her body relaxed from an old tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. There was nothing left that demanded an immediate response. The world could continue making mistakes without it falling on her shoulders. She understood now that she didn't need to be reminded for the effect to remain. The real impact doesn't depend on conscious memory, but on embodied behavior. And that was happening. The last time Margaret passed the intersection, she didn't slow down to observe. She just kept going. That, for her, was the definitive sign that the story had ended the right way. Because in the end, she didn't change the entire city. She changed it enough so that a child could cross the street with less fear, so that a mother could breathe with less guilt, and so that a place would cease to be invisible. And sometimes that's exactly what defines a life well lived. Not how much you do, but how often you stop at the right moment. Time taught Margaret to recognize when a story truly ends. It's not when everything is resolved, nor when the conflict disappears, but when the memory ceases to hurt and simply exist. The intersection no longer provoked any urgency in her. It was just another point in the city, functional, predictable, safe enough not to require constant vigilance. That was rare and precious. She realized that the biggest change wasn't in the streets, but in the people, in the way they looked before crossing, in the almost unconscious care they took to slow down, in the patience that arose without apparent effort. The city hadn't become kinder. It had become less blind. And that was enough to alter destinies. Margaret never spoke publicly again about what happened. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because there was nothing left to explain. The gesture had served its purpose and now belonged to everyday life, not to the narrative. Stories that continue to work don't need to be repeated. They stand on their own. The boy grew up without carrying the weight of the episode as trauma. For him, it was just a different day. A day when someone held his hand firmly enough to organize the chaos around him. Margaret knew that this type of memory manifests itself later, in small decisions, in quiet self-confidence, in well-defined boundaries. She didn't need to witness it to know it would happen. The boy's mother followed suit. She changed jobs, reorganized her schedule, and began to trust her own voice more. She didn't become an activist or a heroine. She simply stopped accepting what had previously seemed inevitable. Margaret always believed that this was the true impact, not creating exceptions, but empowering ordinary people. As the months passed, Margaret went out less and less. Her body demanded rest, and she complied without resistance. For her, aging was never a struggle against time, but An agreement, a silent agreement in which intensity is exchanged for clarity. And clarity, at that point in her life, was worth more. She carefully organized the house. She separated what still made sense from what was no longer useful. There was no excessive attachment, nor dramatic nostalgia, just discernment. Margaret had always lived like that. Even the objects needed to justify the space they occupied. Sometimes he would sit by the window and watch the distant movement of the city. He didn't seek meaning in everything. He had learned that not all silence needs to be filled. Some silences simply confirm that there is nothing left to ask. She occasionally thought about how many women like her exist scattered around the world. Women who have seen too much, who have survived harsh structures, who have learned to act without asking permission. Women who are rarely listened to, but who, when they move, change the environment around them. Margaret felt a deep respect for them, even without knowing them. She also knew that the world remained dangerous, especially for those who didn't fit into the imposed rhythm. Children, the elderly, people with disabilities, women too tired to fight. None of that had disappeared. But now, in at least one part of the city, someone had proven that indifference could be broken. Margaret's name was no longer circulating, and that was liberating. There were no expectations, demands, or projections. She could simply exist. This belated anonymity was a form of rest that only comes when one's conscience is clear. On some nights, he remembered other crossroads in life, decisions made in the dark, hard choices, paths that allowed no return. He compared all of that to the simple gesture of stopping the car, and smiled inwardly. Sometimes the most powerful act is also the most obvious. She never knew exactly how many people were indirectly affected by what she did, nor did she try to calculate it. Real impacts are not precisely measurable. They appear in habits, in deviations from the path, in lives that continue without knowing that they almost didn't continue. Margaret accepted that this had been her last great confrontation with the world, not because she was no longer capable, but because it was no longer necessary. There comes a point when persistence ceases to be courage and becomes attachment. She never confused the two. The body continued to age, as it should, but the mind remained tranquil, without accumulated anxieties. There were no unfinished stories, no words stuck in the throat. The gesture had been made at the right time, in the right way, and that was enough. When Margaret reflected on her own life, she didn't see grandeur. She saw coherence, a sequence of decisions aligned with what she believed to be right at each time. That journey merely closed the cycle with symbolic clarity. She understood now that it's not necessary to change the entire world to live in peace with it. It's enough to not ignore what demands action when faced with it. The rest is not an individual obligation. It's a collective process. The last time Margaret passed through the intersection, she felt nothing special, and that was the strongest possible sign of closure. The place no longer demanded active memory. It had become safe enough to exist without emotional vigilance. She kept driving, without looking back. The future didn't need her constant supervision, and the past was already settled. Because, in the end, Margaret didn't leave a story to be told. He left a crossing to be used. And that, for someone who lived as she lived, it's the rarest and quietest kind of victory. If this story has captivated you this far, it's no coincidence. Some stories don't enter through curiosity. They enter through memory. Now I want you to stop for a moment and think calmly. At what point in this story did you feel something tighten inside? Was that when Margaret stopped the car? Was it when nobody else stopped? Or was it when you realized that sometimes only an experienced woman is capable of disrupting what everyone else has normalized? Write this in the comments. There's no need to explain much. One sentence is enough. Here, each comment is a story that continues. I also want to ask you something important. Where are you hearing this story from right now? City, state, or country? This channel is made up of voices that recognize each other, even from a distance. If this story reminded you of someone, a grandmother, a mother, an aunt, or even yourself at some point in your life, share this video with that person. Sometimes, all someone needs is to know that they are not alone. And if you feel that these stories speak to you, if you understand the weight of silence, of age, of experience, so this is the place for you. Subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications. We don't tell quick stories here. Here we tell stories that last. Read the comments from other women. Someone answer. Say, I felt that too. Because when women recognize themselves, the world changes, even if slowly. And now tell me, what did this story evoke in you? And where are you listening to us from? The next story is already being prepared, and she might be exactly the one you didn't know you needed to hear.